welcome to this virtual event, the U.S.-Taliban deal, 1 year on. I'm Meland Verveer, the director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. Today's discussion is being held in partnership with the Atlantic Council, which has been convening a series of high-level trilateral dialogues with the support of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. The participants in the dialogues are from Afghanistan, Europe, and the United States, coming together as equal stakeholders with the aim of leveraging greater cooperation on the shared challenges and hopefully opportunities ahead. The dialogues were convened to look at the longer-term prospects and the range of minimal conditions necessary to support stability in Afghanistan and to maintain the interests and values of the United States and Europe. You may have seen a recent CNN op-ed by Secretary Madeleine Albright and Rector Mogherini, who was the former High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security. They, along with Sherzad Akbar, are co-chairs of the dialogues as they've been taking place. Sherzad is the chair of the Afghan's Independent Human Rights Commission. In the coming weeks, the trilateral dialogues will be releasing a report with recommendations. The details will be shared publicly soon. In the meantime, please go to the Atlantic Council South Asia site, where you can access the work of the group with published pieces by key experts, including some who are with us today, and the previously aforementioned op-ed. I'm happy to welcome more than 500 attendees from over 80 countries today, along with many more who will be joining us via Facebook. And I want to particularly welcome the many Afghans on the ground who are also tuning in today. We have already received many pre-submitted questions from our audience members, but you will also have an opportunity to submit questions throughout this discussion. You can use your tool on your Q&A feature on your website, on your computer screen, and note the name of your name, the name of your organization, and to whom your question is directed when you write your question. 1 year since the signing of the US-Taliban agreement, US troop numbers are down to their lowest level since 2001. Intra-Afghan negotiations have stalled. A campaign of targeted assassinations has compounded fear and mistrust. And yesterday, 3 female media workers were gunned down in Nangarhar. This is part of a series of assassinations that have been taking place. And on May 1st, looms the potential of full US troop withdrawal. As the new US administration reviews the agreement, the Taliban are increasing violence and traveling the region to court legitimacy. And many international allies fear the consequences of a precipitous withdrawal or the collapse of the Doha talks. With that background, we turn to our distinguished panel. Let me begin with Fatima Galani. She is currently serving as a member of Afghanistan's negotiating team in the peace process. She is one of 4 women on the team. She has served as president of the Afghan Red Crescent Society and in several other top positions with the Red Cross and Red Crescent. During the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, she acted as a spokesperson for the National Islamic Front of the Afghanistan Party in London. She attended the Bonn Conference on Afghanistan in 2001, and after her return, she was chosen for the emergency Loya Jirga, that Grand Council, in 2002. And from there, she was appointed as a commissioner for drafting and getting the new Afghan constitution ratified. Fatima, it is wonderful to have you with us. I know you are coming to us from Doha, and we are looking forward to what you have to tell us. Let me ask about the talks. Have the Taliban been negotiating in good faith? Have you been able to detect their views at all on women and minorities? And how can these rights be protected and not erased? Fatima, we look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Bismillahir Rahman Rahim, Your Excellencies, dear colleagues. It is true that February 2020 brought lots of changes in Afghanistan. It started with steps which was not easy for us to understand it or even approve of it. But there is one fact, in my opinion, a good thing which came out of it, which opened the door for peace talks and put us, anyone who's under the umbrella of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, within the government or outside the government, but within the system, is put in front of Taliban. We got acquainted to each other. At the beginning, it was not easy, I have to admit. For neither side, it was easy. We had to get to know each other and to understand that what we are really representing. They saw in our side of the table that we represent a very new Afghanistan, an Afghanistan which has never been seen before, even during the peace time. I'm talking 40, 50 years ago. Men and women, equally competent, equally in charge, sitting in front of them, young and old, different ethnicities, different languages, different sects in Islam, was right in front of them. And we saw that unknown Taliban that we were sometimes scared, sometimes impressive. We were not sure what kind of people we were facing. It didn't take much that we saw a group of Afghans not agreeing on politics and many other things are trying to talk to each other. If you tell me it is that easy, no, it is not. It will be difficult, but it is not impossible. It was difficult for this mere reason that we came with a different idea. 5,000 prisoners were released, and it was not so much with the blessing of Afghans in general, let alone the Afghan government. It was imposed, sort of. We were put together to talk, which I'm grateful for, and we have to come to a conclusion, and we have to bring peace. How could we bring a peace which could be sustainable? A sustainable peace has to be a just peace. Women's right, humans' right, minorities' right, and inclusive, a very inclusive. Apart from that, this will be a quick fix, like it happened several times before in from the time of the Soviet invasion till today. We saw lots of quick fix, but it didn't work. This time, we cannot afford this to not work. Ambassador, you talked about these wonderful media women, that they were young, educated, hopeful for the future of Afghanistan were killed, and many before them. How long? How long this will go on? That's why this is the time for peace, and we have to start talking about it. Forget about who put us together, forget about that what forced us, but now we are two kind of Afghans sitting in front of each other, and we have to take both sides, take the ownership of these talks and try to conclude it. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. Clearly much is at stake, but thank you for giving us a feeling for what it's like to be at the peace table, and hopes that it can indeed go forward in a productive way. I want to turn now to Ambassador James Cunningham. He's a distinguished diplomat who has served as U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan from 2012 to 2014. Currently, he is a non-resident fellow in the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. And I would call your attention to the blog that he and some of his fellow former U.S. ambassadors to Afghanistan have written on the way forward in Afghanistan. And he will add more to that today, I'm sure. The op-ed is entitled, "How Biden Can Achieve a Sustainable Peace and U.S. Security." He has held numerous diplomatic posts, including U.S. Ambassador to Israel, U.S. Consul General to Hong Kong, acting U.S. Ambassador to the UN, and many, many more. So, Ambassador Cunningham, what are the main challenges that the Biden administration faces in its review of the U.S. Taliban deal, which we understand is ongoing? The Taliban have not adhered to many of the commitments in the agreement, including ending links with al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, reducing violence, which seems to have exacerbated in many ways. And are there consequences to them for the violations of the deal? Where does that stand, and where is the administration at this point, to the best anyone knows?
Well, thank you, Milan. It's good to be here with everybody today. So as they say, in a way, we have deja vu all over again here. We have an American president who faces a choice on whether to proceed with the complete withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. Our allies think we ought to stay on and continue the effort. He's faced with an arbitrary deadline without regard to conditions on the ground and with no serious political plan or diplomatic preparation to even promote, let alone ensure that there's a chance of success as this goes forward. So to my mind, the real challenge that the administration is facing is more than the decision on whether to maintain forces in Afghanistan, given the failure of the Taliban to comply with its commitments. The fundamental challenge of the review is whether a political and diplomatic strategy can be developed that will give us a chance for success in securing peace and stability in Afghanistan, instead of taking a path which will lead to almost certain failure. Like many others, I thought the Doha Agreement was deeply flawed, but I also, as did many others, thought that it could open a door to peace negotiations, and we deserved giving it that chance. As Fatima Galani said, it did open the door for the first time for Afghans to sit together. But before going on, I want to go back a little bit to where we started in February of 2020, because that's important. I went back and looked at Secretary Pompeo's briefing in anticipation of the agreement on February 25th. The agreement was signed on the 29th. And Pompeo said that the agreement sets a timeline for both a conditions-based and phased troop withdrawal and for the commencement of intra-Afghan negotiations. He said, "Our conditions-based withdrawal sets a high bar for the things that will take place to accomplish two objectives: peace and reconciliation, and ensuring homeland security." And he said the US is not required to leave unless the Taliban fulfills their obligations. The secretary also noted the complexity of the negotiations, the mission set, as he said, to deliver good security outcomes for the Afghan people and to create conditions, and this is crucial, to create conditions for the political process to work. He noted that the reduction in violence, which was being observed then as a prelude to signature which was a virtual ceasefire. He noted that the reduction in violence has to continue for a long time, in his words, for the political process to go forward. And in private briefings after the signature of the agreement and in backgrounding to the press, US officials stressed the conditionality of the withdrawal of forces, and specifically the need for genuine progress in peace talks, and the need for as well as the need for the Taliban to break with al-Qaeda. Now, none of this has come to pass at this point. The timeline was never realistic. The Taliban haven't met their commitments, and they really haven't paid any price other than criticism for the violations. And for them, based on their public statements and things they've been telling to others, the negotiation is basically a withdrawal agreement. And I want to note that they continue to hold inhumanely and reprehensibly an American contractor, Mark Frericks, as a hostage. His release should have been addressed in this negotiation, and his release should be a priority. So the basic question has always been, and still is Doha about withdrawal, or is it about getting to a peace that Afghans agree on and can accept? If it's about peace, the agreement needs to be recalibrated to restore conditionality, and a peace agreement must be a fundamental condition for withdrawal. So there's a challenging and even historic diplomatic task for the United States and for our allies, our Afghan partners in the international community. The Taliban have to understand that restoration of the Islamic Emirates is not in the cards, and that peace is a priority and it is possible. They have to realize that the international community will not accept the Taliban return by force and terror. That will lead to isolation, civil war, and space for terrorists to operate in Afghanistan, something that none of us want. So the recently concluded report of the Afghan study group noted the unacceptable risks of withdrawal. And at this stage, the choice before the president may not be pleasant, but it's clear. Will the United States stand with its Afghan and international allies in pursuit of peace in recognition of the sacrifices made and the achievements gained? The cost of doing so is acceptable, but the cost of not doing so will be severe.
Well, thank you so much, and for reminding us what was in the agreement, where it stands today, and the stakes we now confront at this critical moment. I want to go now to Ghizaal Haress, and I hope that your technical connections hold up in Kabul. She is the Ombudsperson for the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, the first woman to lead an anti-corruption institution in Afghanistan. And earlier, she was the only female member of the Afghanistan Independent Commission for overseeing the implementation of the Constitution, leading the institution's work on constitutional interpretation. Need I say, a vital role and a critical topic for the peace talks. She has nearly 2 decades of experience in the area of constitutional law, human rights, women's empowerment, governance, election monitoring, and much more. She has held many important positions and was a member also of the 2002 Loya Jirga. And at that time, she was representing young Afghan refugees living in Pakistan. As if all of this weren't all-consuming, she is also an assistant professor of law at the American University of Afghanistan. Ghizaal, it's so terrific to have you with us today to talk about how you see some of these very critical issues. One of the obstacles in reaching a political settlement is the Taliban's view that the current constitution of Afghanistan is unsuitable, although we know a majority of Afghans want to preserve it. So how do we get around this tension? And why is this such a critical element of the talks?
Thank you, Ambassador Verveer. I'm very delighted to be part of this distinguished panel in this important discussion today. And you're absolutely right, Ambassador. The Taliban have every now and then talked about the Constitution, and they have called it as one of the main hindrances towards peace. Before the negotiations started, Taliban actually characterized the Constitution, and I think they still do, the Constitution of the Kabul administration. They have every now and then called the Constitution invalid. They have labeled it as if it's copied from the West, and that it has been imposed arbitrarily, implemented on the Muslim society. So these are a few things that we keep hearing from the Taliban. And what to me and many other Afghans is very important and crucial is the fact that the Constitution is the Constitution of Afghanistan and of its people. And it's not the constitution of the administrations that run the government. In fact, the governments and the administrations that we talk about are created by the constitution, and they're mandated constitutionally to fulfill their mandate and their duties. The powers they exert, the duties they run are all mandated by the constitution itself. Also ensuring that it's noted that the Constitution was approved following a very inclusive process, a very inclusive constitution making and review process. And an unprecedented public consultation phase that Afghanistan had not witnessed in the past. To just briefly talk about the process, it took 18 months, and it was led by Afghans from all walks of life, including Islamic law scholars. It included travel to all the provinces of the time. The commissions that were in charge even traveled to Pakistan and India to ensure that more Afghans participate and they understand what's going to be the constitution that will govern their states in the futures to come. Overall reports, there are reports that more than 170,000 people participated into the constitutional drafting and review process and presented directly or indirectly presented their opinions. More than 19,000 people across Afghanistan came together in their districts, in their provinces to elect 500 people to participate in the Loy Jirga. And all of that basically explains to us that this was an Afghan-led process. It was a process that was inclusive, that people participated in. And I think what's important to keep in mind is the fact that the respect and acceptance that the Constitution got in the last 16 years is another way to see how the Constitution was inclusive. If it wasn't for its inclusivity, the acceptance of the Constitution would have seen major challenges in the past 16 years. So that's what I think is an important point to keep in mind, and the fact that the Taliban, although their views have always been vague in general, but most of the time they've said that for the Constitution to be accepted to them, it has to be based on Islamic principles, based on historical achievements of Afghanistan, that it must ensure human dignity or national values, social justice and human rights, that it must guarantee Afghanistan's territorial integrity and be prepared by an autonomous Afghan scholars in atmosphere of freedom. It's when you hear issues as such from the Taliban, I mean, I've said that in the past. My advice would always be, why don't you just go and have a look at the Constitution? As a constitutional lawyer, I do agree there are issues with our current Constitution. It's not perfect, and I don't think any constitution around the world is perfect. A perfect constitution does not exist. It has its numerous shortcomings. It has its challenges to its implementation. implementation. But I think the Taliban as well are not really getting into the details and substance of the constitution. The fact that the constitution of Afghanistan introduces an Islamic republic, and the fact that the Islamic principles have been written into the very fabric of the constitution. It introduces a very comprehensive set of rights, not only unprecedented in Afghanistan, but unprecedented in majority of Islamic countries. It introduces meaningful separation of powers and wide range of checks and balances, and also democratic and representative institutions. It ensures equality before the law and recognizes men and women, Muslims and non-Muslims as equal citizens. Not to mention the fact that there's the constitution gives equal value to the Shia and Sunni sects of Islam. So to summarize, basically, the Constitution of 2004 ensures inclusivity, pluralism as the foundations of the Constitution, as the building blocks of the Constitution. It reconciles Islam, democratic values and principles, human rights, and the Afghan culture in the most beautiful way possible. Something that, again, we do not see in many of the countries' constitutions. And while these principles and values are explicitly enshrined in the constitution, the Taliban claim they're not. It is understandable that the Taliban would like to see changes in the constitution. However, the current constitution is open to amendment. That's another important aspect of the constitution to be discussed. And in order to remain a living document and one that can respond to the emerging needs and demands of the society, it should be subject to amendments. Thank you, Ambassador.
Well, thank you, and for really stating very clearly the centrality of the Constitution, as well as its important protections that are going to be the subject of a great deal of discussion if these talks continue to go forward clearly. And now to Ambassador Franz-Michael Mellbin, the former EU Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and head of the EU delegation to Afghanistan. He is also a distinguished Danish diplomat, currently serving as Denmark's ambassador to the UAE and Qatar, and coming to us today from the UAE. He was earlier ambassador to Japan and has held a long list of diplomatic positions. He's also facilitated numerous diplomatic and political engagements in Afghanistan. And we're so fortunate to have him with us today to harken back to his role as the former EU Special Rep for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and to give us his continuing assessments of what is happening at this moment. Ambassador, the region is also very key to supporting peace and security in Afghanistan. What are the main challenges, in your view, of consolidating a regional consensus that encourages and induces regional actors to make positive strategic choices in Afghanistan? Do we need to see a much more robust commitment to regional diplomacy? And why is this so critical?
There's no doubt, and first of all, let me thank you for inviting me today. It's a great honor to be here, and I'd like to thank the previous speakers for having framed the discussion so far in an excellent way. I usually like to say that peace in Afghanistan comes at two levels. One is the intra-Afghan peace, which is, of course, the central point and critical to any Afghan peace, but there's also a regional dimension to peace. And here I think it's very important that we recognize that while there are several key regional actors that will need to be part of a sustainable peace agreement, there are two that particularly stand out, and those two are Pakistan and Iran. So they are at another level than the other regional actors. Not that they can be forgotten. China, Russia, India will all have important roles to play in making sure that there is sustainable peace in Afghanistan. Now, one of the problems is, of course, that there is huge geostrategic competition between all these main actors that I just listed and medium-sized actors, including with the US, who is in lead amongst the allies, together with the European and many other countries that are supporting the Afghan government and the Ghani government. So this leads to a lot of complications because there is no strategic joint goal set that we can lean up on when it comes to sort of getting people to work together on one kind of solution. It will be a difficult compromise, just as we will have many difficult compromises within Afghanistan. Finding a regional consensus will be something that we will have to work very hard on. Now, I did have the opportunity myself as EU Special Representative to work very hard on looking at the options for a regional consensus. And when I started that work, I remember I told the Vice President that was then Mogherini at the time that I was not sure that that would actually derive any success at all, that I was even able to come up with one common factor, one consensus point. But at the end of the day, there was a meeting in Brussels which showed that there were a number of consensus points. And I'll just go through very quickly some of these because I think it does show that in spite of all the differences, going very systematically for common ground can help us find ways. So one of the main points was that everybody, and we're now talking about everybody in the region, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Iranians, Chinese, US, etc., could agree that Afghanistan should not be split. Okay, there's no splitting Afghanistan up into pieces because everybody perceives that as an inherently unstable end state. The other thing was that no country should be able to use Afghan territory as a vehicle for attacking its neighbors. So that was also something that everybody could agree to. They also agreed that nobody wanted to see the return of the Islamic Republic. It's interesting to note that this actually also was a view held by the Pakistanis. And of course, I know a lot of people listening in here and based on sometimes their own experience will be suspicious about Pakistani views when it comes to Afghanistan, but I do believe that they also understand that if the Islamic Republic would come back if we got a Taliban state, so to say, again in Afghanistan, it would be inherently unstable. It would threaten the gains they have done in their own country at an extremely high cost by creating a soft border towards Afghanistan, which insurgent or terrorists inside Pakistan could use as basis against Pakistan. It will also be unacceptable for Iran. This was yet another point. And then there was also agreement on having a constitutional Afghanistan, to have a republic. So it is possible to grind down into some common points. Now, we should not forget that there are also very strong opposing strategic views. And therefore, if you want to succeed if the US administration and together with allies and the Afghan government wants to succeed in building a stronger and expanded consensus on an end state in Afghanistan, it will take a lot of focus and dedicated work, and somebody will need to be appointed to try to work diligently on that task. Incredibly complicated, but there are options and we should pursue them.
Thank you so much both for pointing out areas of agreement, why it's important, but also the work that needs to go on to ensure that there can be a greater sense of consolidation in this. Before we turn to our audience and questions from the audience, I just want to go through one more round of questions on the way forward. So let's start again with you, Fatima. How can the US and international community support the negotiations to ensure that it could lead to that durable peace? You and I were involved in a conversation not too long ago where one of your fellow negotiators pleaded, do not let the peace talks fail. So what are your recommendations to us?
Really, I would repeat that please don't let this process collapse. But also, in order for this peace talks not to collapse, we need much more clarification from our supporters, the US in particular, but in EU, NATO and all. And we need, as Ambassador said, that we need the support of the region. But above all, I would like very much that whoever talks to us, they tell us the whole truth, because eventually it will come up. But I don't want it to linger, and then we will waste time on something, and at the end we see that actually it was something else that they meant. Let's spell it out to us, the team of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, but also to the movement of Taliban, that what is exactly expected from us. If we live in a future Afghanistan, what sort of Afghanistan will be tolerable for the world to continue to support us financially? Because unfortunately, Afghanistan will be needing lots of support to sustain everything, I suppose, for a long, long time. And the human right, women's right, and all this is included. And what is the future holds for both sides of the table, that what sort of home we will be living in.
So Ambassador Cunningham, let's look at it from another perspective, which is what can we expect from the Biden administration? In addition to the Doha talks, which Fatima just underscored, what are those other variables that will need to be considered in strengthening or supporting the Afghan people and a potential for a durable peace? For example, is support of the Afghan National Security Forces one of those elements?
It's certainly one of the elements. As I said earlier, what we have now is we have an opportunity to energetically pursue a genuine peace in Afghanistan, which we should be under no illusion is going to take time and be very difficult. So we need a sophisticated and powerful diplomatic strategy with a security foundation. We need time and space for the politics to operate and develop. And that means that the security situation needs to be maintained, which goes back to the question of the remaining presence of international forces in Afghanistan at low levels, but to support the Afghan security forces so they can provide security for the Afghan people. We need strategic patience, all of us collectively. Deadlines and hopes for rapid outcomes are going to operate against a successful political strategy. The diplomatic campaign that we need to mount has to be multilateral. It's not just the United States. It needs to address multiple issues. As Franz-Michael said, there will be an important regional component to this, as well as internal components in Afghanistan and more broadly. It needs to be multifaceted. It needs to address a variety of threats and concerns, and it needs to start putting together the pieces of a political framework that will get to where we and our Afghan partners want to get. And it needs highest level diplomatic engagement, which is something that, at least on the American side, has been somewhat lacking in past years. When the Trump South Asia strategy first came out 4 years ago now, more or less, I was one of the people who supported it. But in supporting it, I noted even back then that implementing a strategy like that is a tremendous diplomatic and political lift. And to do that, you need the diplomatic instrument, which we have allowed to atrophy. The United States has allowed to atrophy over the last several years. That needs to be restored. And if we're going to get to where we want to go where we want to be in Afghanistan, we need serious high-level engagement from other countries as well, because the kinds of decisions that have to be made cannot be made by acting ambassadors talking to mid-level functionaries in political parties and foreign ministries. They will be made at the highest level, and that's going to take time and building trust to get there. Very importantly, we also need to strengthen and renewed partnership with our European allies and other partners in the international community. And that's the core purpose of the strategic dialogue that you mentioned earlier that the Atlantic Council and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is supporting. We need that partnership is essential for developing a long-term strategy for a stable Afghanistan in a stable region. As Franz-Michael said, the regional component of this is going to be very important. Not only do Afghans need regional support, they also need to have a region that genuinely understands, and refuses to continue hedging, that a stable Afghanistan is in their interest. And we've been talking about this for many years. It never gets done, this developing of a cohesive regional approach, but it needs to be done. And that's will be a key task going forward. Part of that regional structure also needs to be one that constrains Taliban options, particularly their ability to move in the region, their ability to safe haven in Pakistan. And Pakistan will be, again, as always, central to this, it being helpful or acting in ways that are harmful to the prospects for peace. And finally, whatever we collectively do about security forces, those decisions should be based on conditions, those conditions linked to the prospects for peace. That's the connection that needs to be made, and not made based on deadlines. Thanks.
Well, thanks for that dose of reality and the many, many action points that have to be undertaken and fulfilled to go forward. Ghizaal, the Afghans have called for preserving the constitutional system. As you pointed out, they care about it. They've been instrumental to its development. And how can the constitutional order be strengthened now to support this, as well as what is the prospect for supporting a comprehensive power sharing arrangement, which will be another issue to be confronted?
Thank you, Ambassador. I believe Afghans are flexible on some fronts, including if it involves institutional structure, systems of governance, power sharing, when it comes to the constitutional order. But I think something that cannot be compromised upon are our values and principles. A democratic system of governance, representative institutions, and people's right to exercise sovereignty and decide about their future. We must not forget that we are talking with a group and about a group that has proved since the mid-90s that they do not believe in these principles, or at least they have not put it into practice, even if they say they believe in these principles. So there are indisputably ambiguities and gaps in the Constitution of 2004. Like many other constitutions, however, the Afghan Constitution reflects an ambition for its society to struggle towards. It also reflects the fact that for its government, there are specific values that has to uphold, and for the citizens to be able to hold their governments into account. So the Constitution of Afghanistan does hold these principles into itself. Also, for a constitution has to be flexible, to be amended in order to become a more effective document, both for the current time and in order to ensure a stable political order. But something that Afghans have kept emphasizing on, and I think one cannot emphasize enough the importance of this, is how can we preserve the values and principles that we have gained and fought for since 2001. So when it comes to the amendment of the Constitution, the Afghan Constitution is open to amendment, and it outlines specific procedures for amendments. It describes mainly three categories with respect to the amendments. The provisions that cannot be amended, and that is the principles of Islam and Islamic republicanism. But Taliban tend not to look into the principles of Islam and Islamic republicanism. Rather, they would merely focus on an Islamic emirate. Second, the Constitution allows certain provisions to be amended conditionally, and that is with regards to the human rights. I think this is the most important article of the Constitution for the current times for Afghanistan, because even if the Constitution is subject to amendment, the fundamental rights can only be amended if the purpose is to improve them. We need this guarantee, this constitutional guarantee for preserving our gains. And then the last part of the Constitution allows any type of amendment based on the requirements of the time. And if we are talking about a power sharing system with the Taliban, first of all, the Constitution allows it. The Constitution is not rigid with regards to the system of governance, with regards to the type of the political system. So those can easily be amended through the Constitution. What I think is really important at this point in time is for the Taliban to discuss what is it that they want. And they need to be a lot more specific than making these general comments about the Constitution. So the political consensus through a Constitution can guarantee a stable political order. We all agree to that. But again, what we emphasize on is the preservation of the rights and liberties of the Afghan citizens that is in the current Constitution. I think a majority of us agree that the constitutional amendment is a part of the peace process. It is inevitable. But nullifying the current Constitution and making a new one that can truly reflect the views of the majority of Afghans is not only unlikely, but can also be extremely risky. Thank you, Ambassador.
Oh, thank you for giving us that assessment, but also for underscoring the absolute fundamental points that have to be kept in mind. And Ambassador Mellbin, let's go from the regional to the local. Do you think there is space to conduct local agreements at the local level in Afghanistan to reduce violence and to incentivize peace? Is that even feasible?
It certainly is, and I think it's important that as we have a very complex situation surrounding the talks in Doha, that peace talks do not have to look like peace talks. And peace talks are also not linear in their function. They go up and down. There'll be spates of mistrust, setbacks, new instances of violence. These are all part of what peace talks can entail. And we have a complex situation in Doha because, unfortunately, that some of the things that Ambassador Cunningham correctly pointed to was sort of the basis of the agreement were not followed up, and Taliban have been able to, with widespread impunity, to violate the original terms. While the Afghan government position has been withered away, and their negotiation strength has weakened over the time. And the Taliban are, of course, mindful of that as they sit down and talk with partners, and sometimes when they don't answer or don't state what they want, it's because they believe that they will gain more on the battlefield than at the table. But to go back to local deals are happening in Afghanistan all the time. They happened before, they continue to happen, but they are not happening in a systematic way. They are local deals often made by either warlords or local villages or local commanders, either on the government or Taliban side. There can be many reasons for these. There's no strategic direction for who makes these agreements, why they are made, for how long time they are made, are there any costs associated, which there often are. And I think that it would be a huge benefit for the process to say, okay, we have the negotiations in Doha. They are important because it is a venue that also makes people acquainted with each other, like Ms. Galani very correctly emphasized this. very important in trust building and is needed as part of that. But to also win some territory back for the government, to try to see what can be done at the local level. When we look at how the Taliban operate, they make their gains at the local level. This is how they make their gains. They are not fielding thousands of soldiers in big army groups that are running around Afghanistan, making inroads into the Afghan countryside. They are slicing off one small piece at a time by looking into areas which they constantly monitor, whether for whatever reason is a local conflict, where they can go in and support one side, where somebody feels oppressed, maybe by warlordism or by local power brokers that are irregular or denying people their rights. These kind of conflicts is what the Taliban feeds off. And of course, it would be possible to work with a reversal strategy and trying to build with local communities the basis for peace. This has been done previously. There have been efforts. Unfortunately, it has been very difficult to maintain a sustained focus on these kind of efforts. And that's also why there is no strategy for this, because while very useful, there's always been a top priority in the day-to-day security business. And I understand that fully. But I do wish that we from the Allied side and the Friends of Afghanistan would invest more in looking at what could we do to sustainably develop a strategic approach to local deals that the government could use as leverage. Because right now, the only ones who have such a strategy are the Taliban, and that does not seem to be optimal and certainly isn't working in our favor. So
Very interesting.
Can I just round up just one comment to something Dr. Cunningham said? He talked about strategic patience, and he's right, because he talked about the patience you need to carry through a negotiated settlement that is meaningful. But there is a here and now need to stem the tide of the Taliban and to dissuade them from believing that they can see Afghanistan as a walkover. I think immediate action is needed from Afghan side also. Afghans need to stand together in a way they're not doing now, from the US and allies and other countries that are supportive of the legitimate government of Afghanistan. Thank you.
Before we turn to the audience questions, does anybody else want to comment on what a fellow panelist has said or expand on it? If not, we will go for Fatima.
Yes, I mean, everything that which were said by both ambassadors is very, very important. If we can't build a trust for this peace, it's very easy to spoil, and spoilers are always just really there around the corner. And regarding the constitution, I agree with Ghizaal that this is one of the best things that could happen to women of Afghanistan, to minorities of Afghanistan, and general people of Afghanistan. And she's absolutely right. When we talk about with Taliban or even some of our neighbors, they keep on talking about our constitution. But when I challenge them that, okay, which article you're talking about, then you can see it very easily that they don't know. So this is wrong. And this is the constitution of people of Afghanistan. And this will be, as Ghizaal very rightly said, that eventually when we all live together, both sides of the negotiations, us and the Taliban, we live together, we can open it up. But what is the use to talk about it now without even knowing that what exactly they mean about, the changes?
Anyone else? Well, let's go to our audience questions. I'm going to ask Allie Smith to convey them to us.
Sure. Our first question, grouped from a couple, is should the United Nations come into the process more significantly? Should there be a UN mediator or another mediator?
Okay, question about a greater role for the United Nations. Jim?
I've always thought the UN has an important role to play in Afghanistan and in the region, and I think that will continue to be the case, assuming that we do go forward with the peace process. I think whether there should be an actual UN mediator or a senior figure for the region, I think is certainly worth considering. But I think it will become clearer. We'll have a better basis on how to make that judgment sometime in the future when the prospects are clearer. But I personally would be inclined to have some senior international figure, whether it's a representative of the Secretary General or not, but somebody quite senior, given what I said earlier about the need for senior attention, some senior figure to be charged with trying to put together the pieces of a genuine regional strategy for the first time.
Anyone else want to expand on that? Fatima?
We have talked comprehensively with people of Afghanistan through the Ministry of Peace and other means of the civil society. And they always express their concern that it is not that much important that who is doing it, but it is important how it is done. And one of the fears that they show was the chaotic situation that came under the UN supervision at the end of Najib, which was people were really hurt inside Afghanistan. And this is a scenario that no one wants to see in Afghanistan. So it is important how it is done rather than who is doing it.
Okay. Next question.
Sure. There are indications that Ambassador Zalmay-Khalilzad, in his current visit to Kabul, is testing the water for organizing another international conference like the first Bonn conference. How feasible is that, considering that intra-Afghan negotiations haven't proved effective? Is this what the Biden administration is considering?
Who wants to tackle that? Another Bonn conference, let the peace talks go forward. Fatima.
No one wants to answer this. Well, again, I'm saying that there shouldn't be a quick fix. Quick fixes will not work. A very famous poet, Sadi, says that whatever comes quick cannot stay long to take root. So something meaningful has been has started in Doha. Let's give it a chance. And today's Afghanistan is not the Afghanistan of the Bonn conference time. At that time, for every ethnicity group, there was a clear one representative, but now it is not like that. Many other people emerged. Which one will be representing those ethnic groups? So I would prefer that we give a chance to this process to succeed, and then we will take it from there.
You know, I think that is often a point missed, especially by people who have been so long engaged in this, that Afghanistan is very different today in many ways. So that, along with what you said, I think needs to be factored in. Next question, please.
Sure. This question asks, what do we do if the Taliban walk, and how do we keep them at the table? And a similar question, does the West have the staying power should the Taliban instigate a significant spring offensive and pull out of the agreement?
Two very tough questions. What do we do if the Taliban walk? And what about another offensive? Jim, Ambassador Mellbin, please.
Thank you. I mean, if there's an offensive, there will have to be a defense for that. But the question is really about this risk for the Doha agreement. If the US does not do what the Taliban want them to do, which is full withdrawal by the timeline. And it is simply not, in my view, conceivable that we can have a stable outcome in Afghanistan with full military withdrawal at that time. So we should prepare ourselves for a situation where there will be some not insignificant, I'll call it, allied military presence in Afghanistan also after the withdrawal deadline. Now that may lead the Taliban to withdraw. There are different views whether or not that is a likely scenario. I personally believe that this is a card that they may play because it's a free card to play. You can say you walk away and see what happens, and then you can come back next week. It's a very cheap card to play for the Taliban. If they want to put pressure on certain allies who they may feel will be pressured by the fact that there can be a blame game, you know, why was there a walk away, and are we not interested in peace, and do we need to keep our soldiers fighting in Afghanistan, etc. So we should prepare for that kind of scenario. The other kind of question about what about a spring offensive? There's no doubt in my mind that the Taliban, as I said before, feel that they have the upper hand. They are seeking advances on the ground more than they are looking for compromises at the table. And the reset that Ambassador Cunningham pointed to before, and which is much in the vogue of talking about with the Biden administration, will have to factor that in, that unless there is a significant strengthening of the Afghan government position, which does not necessarily involve huge amounts of weapons and people, but a renewed commitment towards supporting the legitimate government of Afghanistan, then it's going to be very difficult, and we need that kind of action in the short term, and certainly before the withdrawal deadline, in my view. Thank you.
Jim, do you want to add to that?
Sure. So as I said in my remarks earlier, yes, we have to anticipate that there will be a bad reaction from the Taliban. This often happens in negotiations, by the way, in difficult situations where one side or the other gets up from the table and says, well, that's it, for whatever reason, I'm out of here. The question is, under what conditions does that happen, and what can be done to get them to come back? That's why we need a serious diplomatic strategy and a serious diplomatic effort. I think the question talked about Western staying power. I mean, I've been continually impressed by the will of our coalition partners to stick with us and our Afghan partners over the years, even if things have gotten difficult and confusing, shall we say, at times. I don't see any reason to think that is going to change. And I think it will be even more likely with a stronger sense of strategy and a partnership between the members of the coalition, and particularly between the United States and our European allies and partners. But also, let's not forget, there are many other countries who are engaged with us in Afghanistan, even if they're not part of the military effort, the security effort. So we need to stitch all that back together and make it stronger. And that in and of itself, I mean, there's no doubt that the Taliban have seen that these fractures in the United States itself and between the United States and our partners provided them, and between the United States and our Afghan partners. There's no doubt that they've seen over these fractures over the past years and have figured out how to take advantage of them. I mean, and they will continue to do that if those fractures exist, and they will continue to do that if we keep saying that the Americans are going to be out by a certain deadline. That's been a fatal flaw in this process for many, in the process of trying to bring stability and peace to Afghanistan for years. And it will continue to be a fatal flaw unless we fix it. And we fix that by focusing on conditions and by focusing on a campaign and a diplomatic strategy geared towards, for the first time, very clearly geared towards peace and a peace negotiation supported by a security foundation.
So conditions-based and really multi engagement, because the US Taliban deal was a US Taliban deal without the engagement of any other partners. So that obviously is a big issue. Allie.
Sure. This question is connected to discussion on the second Bonn conference from Kimberly Dozier at Time Magazine. Do you think it is fair to Afghan voters to have a future power sharing agreement between the Afghan government and the Taliban that's decided by US envoy Zal Khalizad at a Bonn II-like conference rather than at the ballot box?
A variation on a theme. Fatima.
I will take it from another angle. It could have been, because we are angry with what we see, but we don't know what could have been. I mean, had it been just a withdrawal without any kind of process, without even talks, without even prospect of peace, yes, it could have been. I have seen it before. I have been too long in this never-ending story, that there are times that people do walk out from you. Your friends will walk out from you. They will just leave you there. There was a possibility that the US troop and NATO will get out of Afghanistan and just leave Afghanistan as whatever happens, because sera, whatever happens. It didn't happen. I mean, a peace process came out of it. And I'm grateful for that. And I think that we have to, all of us, we have to do everything in our power for this to sustain and continue. The people of Afghanistan has to be included in this. From now on, that now the scenario is going to change a little bit, it is extremely important that people of Afghanistan should be included. The government, of course, but we know the politicians, sometimes they decide things which are good for their own politics. But in order to have something which is good for the people of Afghanistan have to be included. This is my view.
Jim, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, so I don't think any of us know exactly what ideas have been floated or not floated. You have to expect that there's going to be a certain amount of confusion flowing around that. I think it's more important to focus on what are the anchors that exist in this political discussion. So to be charitable, perhaps what the discussion that Ghizaal has launched is about, okay, what are different options for how we could move a negotiation forward? I don't know that. I think simply talking about a second Bonn conference is probably misleading. This is not the Bonn period, as Fatima said. But there are anchors to this process. And one of them, as Ghizaal explained, I think very articulately, is the Constitution. Afghanistan has a government, a legitimate government recognized by all the other countries of the United Nations. It has a constitution. It has democratic processes that are difficult, but we all know that democracies are difficult these days. And you can't just ignore all that. So there are anchors that can help guide us collectively as we go forward. And another one is, this is responsible first and foremost. One of the things that Secretary Pompeo also said on February 25th, what's necessary here is for Afghans to come to agreement with Afghans in all their complexity. And that has to be at the core of this. And nobody is going to decide the outcome for Afghanistan, as they should not. It's been a principle of mine ever since I got to Afghanistan as ambassador that Afghans needed to take responsibility for their own political future. And the negotiations are one way of trying to do that. But we all need to keep in mind that if there is going to be a durable, sustainable outcome, a political outcome of this, it has to be one in which Afghans primarily are first and foremost are invested, not some quick solution conceived from the outside and kind of floated out there as a way to resolve this problem.
And those tendencies are always there, I dare say. But thanks for mentioning those anchors in the process, those critical fundamental pieces. Next question, please.
Sure. This one is also for Ambassador Cunningham. Ambassador Khalilzad discussed the formation of a participatory government among several other new proposals that could accelerate the peace process. Can you explain this and what do you think?
No, I can't explain it. But as I also saw reports that there are several ideas being floated around or brooded about. So again, to go back to what I said, what matters is respect for the fundamentals of a process that you need to have. If I don't want to speculate too much, but one of the things that might be going on is that sometimes when things get stuck, you kind of, as a negotiator, you try to kind of break it up and see if there's a different way to assemble the parts that might be more promising for one reason or another. And maybe that's what's happening. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But it clearly is the case that, there are some difficult decisions to be made in the coming weeks by several parties, not just the United States, and by President Biden. And at the end of that process, as I said earlier, hopefully we will have a better political strategy together with our partners and with our Afghan partners for moving ahead.
Next question, please.
Sure. This one is for Ambassador Mellbin, following up on your insights on the divergent views of regional actors. What could regional actors agree on, and how can we best consolidate consensus?
The various regional actors have very diverging views, and this is part of the complexity. If you look at it in a very simple way, we have India, China standing off towards each other, north-south, and we have Iran, Pakistan, east-west. And then we have the added complication of the strategic outlook of the US and Russia into Afghanistan. So it's difficult to point to where these interests converge, as we talked about before. What I do think can be done is to try to find this common ground on how do we achieve a stable Afghanistan. The countries surrounding Afghanistan all have an inherent long-term interest in a stable Afghanistan. However, as long as they cannot envision the end state, and some of the countries I've spoken with have said this in very precise terms, as long as nobody can guarantee them that this is what the end state will look like, they will hedge. And this is what is happening right now. So the hedging strategies that we're seeing and the lack of full commitment towards one outcome or the other is very much due to these strategic risk that the surrounding countries perceive of committing to a certain political outcome that they are not sure will actually be the real outcome. And this also has to do a lot with how Afghan politics work, because there is a widespread understanding within the international community or the neighboring community that the kind of deal that will be a sustainable peace in Afghanistan will have to be one that carries quite broadly through the Afghan political elite. And right now, there's of course strategic competition among several of these companies for the attention, the support, and the loyalty of various politicians inside Afghanistan. So it's really chicken and egg situation where, yes, you can probably find opportunities to come together and have a joint vision, but there will need to be this feeling of certainty amongst the neighboring countries before they start committing to that in any meaningful way. And that's why I can fully support Ambassador Cunningham's suggestion before. You will need a senior person, very senior person with a very strong political mandate to drive such a discussion, because it is about, at the end of the day, real important strategic interests involving all of these countries. And Pakistan also, I know a lot of listeners here today will have very strong views about Pakistan. Regardless of that, we have to accept that it is a fact that Pakistan also has legitimate concerns and legitimate strategic concerns when it comes to what happens in Afghanistan. And just that one puzzle piece, just this one single puzzle piece, is not easily resolved. So yes, it can be done, but it will probably be at the very end of a process where the Afghans themselves have found a formula that then can be tested towards the partners around. Not meaning that we shouldn't work on it, and it's futile to work on it previously. It's very important to work on it previously, but it will grow out of a growing common understanding of the situation and possible acceptable end states for everybody involved. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Sure. I'm going to ask two at the same time here. The first is on power sharing. How can we get an agreement that everyone can live with? And does a democratic system address this? Perhaps Ms. Haress and Ms. Gailani can answer that one. And then one on U.S. troop withdrawal. What specific conditions should be met before the United States withdraws more troops?
Okay, let's go with the first part of that on power sharing. Fatima?
Well, power sharing is the core of the whole talk. I mean, this is exactly what will happen at the end. That's why it is important that it should not be done in a hurry. It should be done properly and very carefully, so it will not result to a chaos. But when we are talking about a common home, this is exactly what it is, because no matter what, the war, the peace, the elections, everything is for a political, way and politically taking power. So yes, eventually we have to live together. We have to accept each other. But this acceptance should be guaranteed by all involved, region, important countries around us, and above all the countries that were going to help us to build the future of Afghanistan. That all the right things, all the values has to be very carefully spelled out without any misunderstanding. That if we want help from the world, what kind of Afghanistan these countries expect from us. This is what I believe.
Ghizaal?
Yes, I think when it comes to the power is something that as I discussed previously, it is in the Constitution. The Constitution does not disallow anything as such, so it is possible. But I think what's important is for us to understand what is it that we're going to talk about. We need to get into the details, and as Ms. Gailani rightly said, we probably need some time for that. We probably need to understand what both sides want, particularly on the side of the Taliban, because they've always been extremely vague. Whether the power sharing can result in democratic values, if I understood the question correctly, I think that is a huge concern. If we are going under the current constitution and respecting the current constitution, then maybe some of the democratic values will be protected and preserved. But if we are particularly if the West is not using its leverage over the Taliban, and if we are not, if we do not go into an amendment process as prescribed by the Constitution, then it's going to be very risky, and we might even lose what we have achieved so far.
Ghizaal, let me ask you about the Taliban's repeated statements about their desire to have an Islamic state with their interpretation of Islam, and as they often talk about the traditions. What does this represent for the protections that the Constitution guarantees to women? And what can you help us parse that when they make those statements, what that ultimately means?
Thank you, Ambassador. I think the answer to that is if we just look at the past and look at how the Taliban have governed and how they have practiced their ideology. I think first of all, when they talk about an Islamic state, they say an Islamic state, but they're not clear about what exactly do they want. And going with their interpretation is very risky, because under their interpretation, suicide attacks are acceptable, while for majority of the Muslim society, that is not. So this is just one example of what do we get out of that Islamic interpretation of the Taliban. Secondly, I would like to draw your attention to the constitution of the Taliban. So it's not just what we see from our experience under the Taliban, but also what they had put on paper. In 1998, they had drafted and approved a constitution. They revisited it in 2005. And when you look at the content, the substance of that constitution, it's shocking. I sometimes even use the terms such as it's terrifying. It's really terrifying, because when you look at the democratic values, no representative institutions. People do not participate in public life and in decision making in the country. The country is run by an Amir, and Amir is responsible for almost everything in the country. It has a final say whether we're talking about legislative affairs, judicial affairs, or executive affairs. But then something else that is extremely shocking in that constitution is the fact that the constitution does not use the term woman even once. Although it even requires hijab or covering up of the face, makes it mandatory, but it does not say it's mandatory on women, because it does not want to use the term women. We have not, even if we have seen them talk on women's rights and women's issues, all they have said is in accordance with Islam, but then they do not go so far as to explain how in accordance with Islam. What is their interpretation? What do they want to say? What we have seen as their interpretation previously is that women cannot work. And even now, the targeted attacks. I mean, yesterday's incident of the journalist being killed, and being killed at the same time in two different places. Another female journalist of the same media outlet being killed a few months ago. I mean, all of that, what does it tell us? Does it really say that the Taliban have changed and they would allow or tolerate women as women have emerged in the last and after their government in the last 16, 17 years? So that's the problem. And then also one more thing that is not exactly as per your question, but another thing about their constitution is the fact that they want everything on the basis of Islamic and Hanafi jurisprudence. I am a follower of Hanafi jurisprudence, but I would be very uncomfortable if the other religious sects in Afghanistan, particularly the Shia followers, are not respected and protected under the constitution, or the religious minorities, the Hindus and the Sikhs, are not protected under the constitution of Afghanistan as the citizens of the country. So these are the few things that you see under their constitution. Everything in the part in accordance with Islamic law, but their interpretation has been vague, has been contradictory at times, self-contradictory, and it has usually not been as the modern scholars of Islamic law would agree upon in the rest of the world.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions, please?
Sure, we'll do one final round of questions here. The first one is from Ms. Gailani. The Taliban delegations are traveling throughout the region courting legitimacy. Is this helpful or harmful to the peace process? And should countries refuse to see them until they enter into serious intra-Afghan negotiations? And the last one, building off Ms. Harris's comments on inclusion, how can the negotiating team and the Biden administration ensure women's rights and their achievements are included in the agreement with the Taliban?
So Fatima, first to you.
It is difficult for us to tell other countries what to do, what not to do. But now that we are in a peace process, and this Islamic Republic of Afghanistan is recognized by the same countries which received the Taliban, at least we expect from them to have just a talk with us that what will be helpful for us, the negotiators, if they did. I give you an example. Most of people who talk to us regarding what will be helpful is the UN, EU, and NATO, and that's it. Muslim countries, they hardly came forward to ask from us that what could they do which will be helpful. But if, when they went to Iran or they went to Pakistan, if the countries which recognize the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan as as Afghanistan as we are representing. So when they were received, where there were women in the delegation of the Pakistan side or the Turkey side or the Iran side to show them that this is the right thing to do? Did they talk about the values? Did they take these things seriously for us? So that's why it is not for us to tell them who should see them or who should not see them. But if we are recognized and our ambassador exists in your countries, then at least consult with us that what will be helpful for us women in particular, but for the whole process of peace. So I think we deserve that much. Thank you.
And Ghizaal, back to you.
Yes, thank you. I think when it comes to women's inclusion, I think our suggestion to the Biden administration is that the women's rights, the protection of the rights of women has to be on the top of the agenda. I don't think that the peace negotiations are going to be successful if you leave half of your society off the table. I think our biggest achievement has been the fact that we do have women representatives sitting around the table and talking. This in itself is a big achievement, and we know that they are fighting hard for protection of women's rights and human rights. But I think it's also a matter of gesture. I think something else that we have to see in terms of when the Taliban talk about women's rights in accordance with Islam, does that mean from their part or from their views and opinions, women should not be part of the negotiation process? Because we have never ever seen a woman representative from the side of the Taliban. And as Ms. Gailani rightly said, there's never a woman, even when they travel. I'm not sure, but I would be pretty confident that there is no woman whatsoever in their office or in their delegation in Qatar. So I think what's important is that we need to make certain things conditions and certain things as our red lines that we should not cross. And my advice to or suggestion to the Biden administration would be when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to their inclusion in the peace talks as one of the main agenda items, I think there should not be any easements, and I think this should remain as a very rigid agenda. Thank you.
Fatima, I think you wanted to come in on that Thanks,
Yes,
Ghizaal.
I just wanted to add, we criticize the Taliban not bringing, women in their negotiations, but I have also a little bit of complaint from our own people, from our side, that which one of these political groups are our female representative? They're all male, aren't they?
So lots of culpability. Does anybody else want to have the last word? Either ambassador before we close? Yes, please, Ambassador Mellbin, and then Jim.
Just a very short comment on talks with the Taliban from the neighboring countries. I mean, they've all talked with the Taliban always, so to say, more or less intensely, but they all had those contacts. They have an interest in understanding what will happen, and they're also hedging through their contacts with the Taliban because they don't know what will the end state of Afghanistan be. This is not a problem in itself. What is worrying is if people start giving the Taliban a legitimacy which they do not deserve under the current circumstances, but must be something that grows out of a negotiation where they prove that they actually are looking for a political settlement. This is why things like delisting them from the UN list, etc., there should be a no-go. And I also think that while I cannot sort of speak for my own country here, but I think a personal friendly advice to some of the neighbors out there to maybe consider more carefully how Taliban delegations are treated and promoted maybe sometimes by some of the neighbors as they visit. Don't have to go there necessarily. Thank you.
Good advice. And the last word, Ambassador Cunningham.
So first of all, I agree completely with what Franz-Michael just said. To go back to the point of changing the Taliban mindset and the importance of the region and even the Islamic world, I think the point that Fatima made about there are important symbols that regional interlocutors can use with the Taliban. One of them would be, are women part of their delegation when they're talking to the Taliban, and would be telling the Taliban about what the modern Islamic world looks like in different countries with different practices. Now that's a small thing. It would be relatively easy to do, but it could also, that kind of thing can be important over time. To go back to something I said earlier, one of the core diplomatic and political tasks going forward in the context of the negotiations will be convincing the Taliban that the outcome that they think they are headed for is not going to happen. And not to repeat what I said earlier, but that's a crucial task. And one of the questioners asked what conditionality means. So conditionality means that the premises upon which this negotiation is based has to be realized and be seen. So that means genuine security, a genuine ceasefire, and a clear and meaningful progress in the negotiations, so that all the participants are comfortable that this process is headed for and will get to where it's intended. And we're a long way away from that right now. And that's the principle that needs to be restored. We don't have military forces in Afghanistan because we want to. We have military forces in Afghanistan because we collectively are trying to come to an outcome that would be better for the country and the Afghan people, but also better for the region. And we need some time to do that.
Well, thank you all so much. We've reached that point of the end of our discussion. I can't say enough about how comprehensive and important this has been, touching on those bedrock principles, those anchors, those red lines, whatever we call them, reminding us what's at stake, and all of the strategies and options that can be pursued and those that need to be pursued. and a great sense of urgency. So thank you to Fatima Galani, to Ghizaal Haress, to Ambassador Mellbin, and to Ambassador Cunningham for spending so much time to really grapple with these very tough issues today. We couldn't have had a more expert, experienced group of people to tackle these very difficult issues at this critical juncture for Afghanistan's future and frankly for all of the stakeholders. I want to once again thank the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center for their partnership today, and most especially the continued work that is going on to advance a sustainable and just peace in Afghanistan. Stay tuned, of course, for the task force report. There will be a recording of this event and key recommendations that came out of it at our website at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. So thank you all so very much to our audience from around the globe and to each of you, especially for the time you devoted to this. And really more than that, to the commitment you continue to demonstrate and to your leadership. So thank you so much. Stay well. Ever onward in this difficult task. Bye, everybody.